Hello, and welcome to the first lecture in our new periodic lecture series, Credible Catholicism. My name is Paul O'Hagan. I'm the campus coordinator for Canadian Martyrs Church and Chaplaincy. If you're one of the few who can join us in person today, welcome. It's nice to see smiling faces, even if they're behind masks. Welcome as well to everyone who's joining us on the live stream and anyone who is viewing this lecture in the future. First, I'm going to say a few words on our procedure for tonight. Second, I'm going to briefly introduce our lecture series. And then finally, I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. If you're tuning in on the live stream, you'll have the option to chat with one another and to submit questions for Father Paul. There will be a question period following the talk, and we will give voice to any relevant questions that you have posted in the chat. So please feel free to post your questions during the lecture. I'll be monitoring the chat, keeping track of those questions, and then reserving them for the end. If you're viewing the talk on YouTube's website, you will not have access to the chat. So to access the chat, please attend the talk through the Canadian Martyrs website. That's all for the housekeeping. So let's turn our attention to the second point, our lecture series. So a couple of questions. First, why is it a periodic lecture series? And why is it called Credible Catholicism? It's periodic because while there are only 3 lectures currently planned for this summer, it's our intention to offer new installments of the series periodically in the future. So if you enjoy these lectures that we're having this summer, please stay tuned for more. The series is called Credible Catholicism because we hope to present piece by piece and bit by bit the eminent, provable, and understandable truth of the Catholic Church. We believe that the Catholic Church is the true church, and that this fact can be established for each of us within the course and context of our life. This lecture series is an attempt to gesture toward that reality, and to help our participants come to grips with the rich intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. The faith, if we're being honest, is sometimes considered incredible in our contemporary culture and in the public institutions of our country. This lecture series as a whole will enable participants to engage with their faith in the midst of our contemporary intellectual and cultural context. And so this summer, we're going to begin by presenting a brief, general, and admittedly incomplete introduction to the Catholic worldview. Tonight's lecture is on Anthropology. Next month, and in August, we will hear lectures on Theology and Ecclesiology. Our speaker for this evening is Father Paul Pearson. Father Paul is the Provost of the Toronto Oratory. For over 30 years, he's taught at St. Philip's Seminary in Toronto. In addition, he's currently nearing the final publication stages of his English commentary on Dante's Divine Comedy, titled Spiritual Direction from Dante. His years of teaching and spiritual guidance have borne tremendous fruits over the course of his ministry, including our very own pastor and chaplain, Father Marcus. So please join me in welcoming Father Paul.
I'd like to thank everyone here at Canadian Martyrs and the Chaplaincy for inviting me. It's a lovely opportunity to be able to talk about the faith and to be able to give the faith a proper, rational foundation, because it has one. A little bit of background in terms of approaching the faith in this way. I grew up in a Mennonite community, and I'd fallen away from that because it was the 70s, and people fell away from things. But when I started studying philosophy in university, especially the philosophy of Aristotle, which seems so far away from things Catholic, I began to recognize that there was an objective truth, and we could discover something about that truth using our reason. And as I discovered more and more of this truth with the help of people like Aristotle, I began to think that the Christianity I grew up with wasn't so bad after all. Many of the things the philosophers came up with, Christianity held too. And as time went on, I became more and more convinced that the only place that was defending the truths that I thought were important and knowable by reason alone was not the schools of philosophy. It was the Catholic Church. I was working with a pro-life group. They chose me to be president because I wasn't a Catholic. I was convinced that the pro-life argument was extremely straightforward. Is it a life? Yes, it's obviously alive. Is it a human life? Well, it isn't a frog. Therefore, it must be a human life, and if it's a human life, it's an innocent human life, and you shouldn't take innocent human life. Why is that a difficult argument? But the only support I seemed to be getting was from a couple philosophers who were sort of oddballs, and from Catholics. And that's when I began to recognize what it meant to say that the Catholic Church had the fullness of the truth. Wherever you find the truth, it fits into the big picture. And the big picture is what we possess by this gift. We call the deposit of faith. One of the big issues that people have in trying to understand difficult issues is something we call a false dichotomy. Is it this or is it that? Is Jesus human or is he divine? Well, you got people who argue that he's human, and they can argue pretty persuasively that he's human. You could have people who argue that he's divine, and it sounds pretty good. And the reason both sides sound pretty good is that both of them are true. When you ask, is Jesus human or divine, the answer is yes. Is the church a human institution or a divine institution? Yes. It's both of those because it's a complex reality. The study of the human person, what it means to be a human being, is what anthropology is about. Anthropos is the Greek word for human being. So anthropology is the study of human nature, the human person. And the study of the human person has been plagued by this sort of false dichotomy. Is the human person fundamentally a spiritual thing or fundamentally a bodily thing? The Catholic Church answers the question, yes. It's a complex reality. In fact, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 365, it says that the human person is a composite of body and soul, a putting together of body and soul. And what makes the person is not the body by itself or the soul by itself, but the union of body and soul. That's what we mean by a composite, something that's put together. The person cannot be reduced to either a body or a spirit. And mistakes happen as soon as you try to make it an either-or question. Let's think about how people have made that mistake in the past. Many people, following the original lead of people like Plato, have argued that the human person is basically a soul. He calls it a soul using a body. I drive a broken down old Elantra. It still works. It's going to work for years, I hope. But when it doesn't work anymore, I'm going to trade it in, and I'll get a new one. I had a Sentra before that, and I had a Plymouth Horizon before that. And you know, it didn't change me when I changed my car, because my car is merely something I drive. I get out of it when I'm done. It isn't part of me. I know the car commercials try to convince you that buying this car will change who you are, and that somehow you'll enter into this organic unity with this car because of this special upholstery. But in fact, that doesn't happen. It's something you can trade in. You see, if I'm just a soul that uses a body, my body is basically disposable. And I should be able to do what I want to with it. I should be able to alter it if I want to. I should be able to get rid of it if I want to. Reincarnation depends upon this view of the human person. Since I'm a soul, I could be the same person in a different body and still be me. When people ask me whether I believe in reincarnation, I always do this. Because I think if I came back, I'll come back as an asparagus. I can't be me and be in an asparagus body, but I can't be me and be in your body either. Because who it means to be me is the composition of my body and my soul. Other people, a lot of modern scientists would fall into this camp, would argue that the human person is really only a very sophisticated and complicated body. When we talk about souls, they would say, oh, well, you're just using vague words to cover up the fact that you don't understand things very well. And as soon as you understand neural physiology a little more accurately, then you'll realize that all this soul talk is just a way of papering over the cracks of your knowledge. You don't know about all the programming that goes into your brain, so you say that human beings have freedom. You don't understand how the human brain can put together images, and so you talk about there being this intellect inside of you. You don't understand how your brain makes connections, so you talk about reason coming up with new truths. But once you understand the programming, this view would say, you'd recognize that's all fake. You're programmed, and you just don't know the key to that program. This idea leads to determinism. We're all basically programmed and determined. And people who believe that the human person is only a body can't get around the fact that the human person must then be somehow determined, hardwired. But seeing the human person as a composite changes all of this. And I believe that this is both a philosophical and a theological idea. It isn't just something that the church tells us. The church does tell us, as I just read from the Catechism 365. But it's something that the brighter philosophers were able to figure out too. And for this, I go back to Aristotle in his work De Anima, on the soul. Aristotle argued that obviously human beings have bodies, and that our ability to know, as we'll talk about later, is something that comes to us through our bodily senses. I can feel this lectern, I can see you, I can hear my voice bouncing around. And all of that information comes into me, but then something deeper inside of me works on that. And there are some things that I do that I couldn't do if I were merely a body. Some functions that require me to be immaterial. Aristotle argued that that happened because we were able to know things in a universal way. We were able not only to know human and identify people as human, we were able to define what it means to be human. I had a dog when I was little, and this dog would attack men over the age of about 30, especially if they were in uniform. He must have been badly treated, and so he would see our postman or the meter man or the delivery man come around to the back door to drop off a package or to read the meter, and he would go crazy. He could tell. If a woman came and do it, not a problem. If somebody came not in a uniform, not an issue. But that dog couldn't tell you the difference between a man and a woman. He could identify it, but he couldn't define it. We could stop and think what it means to be a male or a female, what it means to be human or not human. He could identify it, but he couldn't understand it. When we reflect on something universal, that's only possible if my thinking power is outside of material. Now, that's a bigger argument that we can go into right now. But that's the argument that Aristotle makes to show that there has to be a knowing power inside of me that's not just material, that rises up above the material, and that we call the intellect. And if that intellect is immaterial, which it has to be in order to know in this way, then that intellect can't die. It must be immortal. So here's this pagan telling me that the human soul, unlike the souls of animals, the human soul, because it's immaterial, must be immortal. So, philosophers think that? The answer is, well, if they're doing their philosophy well, they do. Why is this so important? What difference does this make? Well, if you and I are both just spirits, and we're all equally human, which we'd argue for, then your spirit and my spirit would be the same. We'd have the same nature. If I take a triangle and another triangle and I consider them in the abstract, I just have one idea of triangle. It's only when I write it down on a piece of paper that I get two of them. I could take my notes for the talk and Xerox them, and if I did that, I'd have copies of them. But in order to do that, I'd have to have multiple sheets of paper. I'd have to have something to copy it onto. Without a body, you can't have many different individuals of the same sort. Being an individual requires me to have a body and a soul. You see, we're equal because we share in the same sort of soul. So each one of us has a soul which is 100% human, just as human as anybody else's. But my soul lives in this body, and your soul lives in that body, and some of the parts of my body don't work as well as others. And that's part of my individuality. That's part of what it means to be me. Who I am is tied up with this particular body. This makes my genetic makeup something important. That's why Catholics think it's an interesting thing to study genetics, because we're seeing not a blueprint that makes me determined, but I see all that goes into making me unique and individual. If we are equal with respect to our souls, but distinct with respect to our bodies, this might also suggest, and this in these days will be slightly more controversial, that perhaps issues like gender cannot be entirely separated from our bodiliness. What it means to be me is living inside of this male body and being united to it. One of my parishioners said, "You seem to understand men very well." I said, "I've been one my whole life." You can't help but experience life from the inside of you. One of my confreres is colorblind. His experience of the visible world is very different from mine. I was brought up by an artist, and I was always taught to compare the colors and textures of things, see how the light works on this and where the shadows are, see the color of the shadows compared to the color of the thing not in light. I was constantly being trained in color. But he doesn't see it. What he does see is a sort of muddy brown most of the time. If I ask what color something is, he says, "Is it brown or is it red?" Those are his two guesses. And of course, the experience of life in a body like that is going to be different, isn't it? If you live a life in chronic pain, your experience of the world will be different from other people's. And all of the experiences you've had in this body of yours has made your life different. And from the outside, no one can understand that fully. Your life has made you unique, and not even you can figure that out entirely. We're sort of mysteries even to ourselves. But where does that mystery come from? Not from a mysterious soul. My soul is the same as yours. Where it comes from is this unique body that I have. And if it's true that this body makes me who I am, and my soul is meant to be with my body, there's another conclusion we could draw. This is one of the conclusions that Aristotle wasn't able to draw on his own. In his book on the soul, after arguing for the fact that the human soul must be immaterial, he then asked the question, well, what does the human soul do when it dies? Where does it go? Because it gets all its knowledge through the body. It needs information from your imagination, which is in your brain. What happens if you, like the scarecrow, don't have a brain? How is your soul going to work? What are you going to do for all eternity? And Aristotle said, I don't really know. It's one of the few times, with his arm twisted behind his back, he admitted he couldn't figure it out, even though the Middle Ages called him the master of those who know, which has always sounded like a great title to me, the master of those who know. But this he couldn't figure out on his own. The human soul didn't seem to be able to function on its own. Why would God make you a composite of body and soul, only to have you live for 60, 70, 80, 90 years maybe, and then to live for the rest of eternity a half being? That doesn't seem to make any sense. This issue about how does the soul continue on without the body was one that St. Paul had to face. He knew that the Greeks were still bothered by this centuries after Aristotle. And when he was preaching in Athens, he mentioned the resurrection of the body. And people laughed at him a bit, but they were also intrigued. Said, that would solve a lot of problems. That would explain how we could think after death. That would explain how we could remain the individual that we are after death. Getting a body back, the resurrection of the body, which is part of our creed, makes perfect philosophical sense. It solves a lot of problems. But which body would you get back? We've already said that reincarnation won't happen, because if I got your body, who would I be? I'd be you. The only body I can get back is my own. If my body makes me be the individual that I am, if I'm going to get a body again, and I'm going to stay me, it has to be the same body that I get back. And that's exactly what the church teaches when it talks about the resurrection of the body. It says we will receive again at the resurrection, at the end of time, this same body that we had here, although glorified. It can't be a different body, otherwise it would be a different you. It wouldn't be you who had eternal life, it'd be somebody else. So let's think for a moment about this idea of the human being as a composite. We've talked about it in a general way. Let's now focus upon knowledge and desire. How do we know things as a human being? Well, we know them not merely as a body or merely as a soul, but as a composite. Some people would argue that we only know as a soul. These people would sort of think of ourselves as sort of spirits floating around, and the only ideas we'd have would be the ideas that were planted into our minds from the beginning. We call these people idealists, because the only sort of knowledge we have are these innate, inborn ideas. But if that's true, my knowledge isn't real knowledge about the outside world. I could pick up these glasses and say, these are glasses, but how do I know that? I have an idea of glasses in my mind, but how do I know that it corresponds to the outside world if I'm not connected with a body that can take in information? If I'm just a soul, I'm just floating inside my little space, and the only ideas are the ideas I have. Can I talk to you? Well, not really, because your ideas are floating around in your head. There's no possibility of debate, no possibility of learning. You either have the ideas or you don't. How would I teach you? Am I going to talk to you? Well, talking isn't going to work because it goes through your ears and your body. And if you don't have a body connected with your soul, I don't have any way to communicate with you. Preaching, teaching, evangelization, education, all becomes impossible. This, I think, is really a philosophical dead end. You can't talk to anybody. You're just caught up in your own little world. And so maybe saying that there's only a body might be a better solution. But that doesn't work either. Because if you say you're only a body, exactly the same conclusion comes. You're going to be caught in your own little world. Why? If all that I have is a body, the only things I can know are sensations that come to me through my sense organs, like feeling these glasses or seeing them, and that comes to my brain. Those are little electrical, chemical impulses that are happening in my visual cortex, for example. They're just little physical realities in my brain. So what is it that I really know? All that I really know is that I have these little physical things happening in my brain. If you touched these glasses and looked at them, you'd have physical realities in your brain. But how can I compare yours to mine? I can't really, because your perceptions are your perceptions. Mine are mine. I remember when we were redecorating our church. My church burned down in 1997, and we rebuilt it in the year 2000, dedicated at the beginning of 2001. And one of the ladies saw a picture that we had in the church before the fire. She was glad it burned, and said, it was a picture of, a very symbolic picture, and the Holy Family was there. My church is the Church of the Holy Family. And in the background were 3 trees, which are going to be the 3 crosses of Calvary, and a deer with a wound in its side. A heart. The sacred heart, perhaps. And this very stern Irish woman stood there with her arms crossed and said, "That man can't be a painter. You'd think he never even saw a goat." It isn't a goat, it's a deer. She just wouldn't hear anything about it. It was a bad goat. There was no talking to her. How do you convince somebody that's actually a deer, not a goat? It's a good picture of a deer, not a bad picture of a goat. There are some things you just can't argue with. I painted the organ a particular color. It was my job. Everybody in my community thinks that the organ is green. It's blue. It has a little bit of green in it, but it's blue. I saw the color separation, and it's blue with a little bit of green and a little bit of silver in it, but it's blue. But can you argue about that? Not really, because they see it and they say, "Oh, that's green." If all you have are your sensations, your perceptions, then how can I say my perceptions are better than your perceptions? Once again, we can't really discuss things or argue unless we have some way of coming to a knowledge which is absolute or objective that we can communicate through our sensation. I need a spirit that can think these universal thoughts, but I need a body through which I can communicate and hear your communications. Without a body-soul composite, we just can't talk. And having a lecture series would be sort of dumb, because there's no way you can understand what I'm talking about, and no way that I can understand your questions. But we believe that talking makes sense. We believe that arguing in right circumstances and with the proper tone of voice is actually a good thing. You see, even if we can't figure out all these things in our mind, we act appropriately. We act as though talking and learning is possible. But it's only possible if you think about human nature in the right way. And that means a composite of body and soul. You can see practically why this is so important. When I'm talking about very abstract things in the seminary, I teach a course called Natural Theology, which is basically everything you wanted to know about God through reason alone, but we're terrified to ask because the answer might make your head explode. And I'll talk about very abstract things like human freedom and God's predestination. And the very first question that seminarians always ask is, can you give us an example? They want something concrete, something particular that they can take in through their senses. And after I've given them an example, somebody else's hand will go up and he says, can you give us another example? We run to examples. We want something concrete. You're having trouble figuring out trigonometry. Well, let me draw you a right triangle for you, and we'll start drawing the picture and say, this, the ratio between this side and this side is what a sine is. This is what a cosine is. This is what a tangent is. When you have the picture in front of you, when you have the diagram, when you have the YouTube video, nobody reads instructions anymore, do we? We just find the YouTube video. Why is that so helpful? Because it's not just words, you should actually see somebody doing it. We need examples because we learn through our sensation. You could see this is true in another way, a theological way. When God decided to reveal to us the fullness of his revelation, he didn't do that by talking to us in very complicated words. He didn't teach us a course in Trinitarian theology. He didn't send us a treatise on systematic theology. He came in human flesh so that we could see him, and as St. John said, touch him with our own hands, so we could hear his words. You see, the best way for human beings to learn is for them to learn by experiencing. And so the apostles, the eyewitnesses, were able to see God for himself. They were able to walk around with God, listen to his words, and see his miracles. That first-hand experience, seeing it with their own eyes. What did St. Thomas say when he didn't believe in the resurrection? I'm not believing it until I put my finger in the wounds of his hand, to put my hand in his side. Then I'll believe. And when our Lord comes into the upper room the week after Easter, what we call Mercy Sunday or Low Sunday, he didn't say, Thomas, you're a bad man. No way am I going to let you do that. He walked into the room and said, go ahead. Put your finger in my hand. If that's what you need, if that will help you, go ahead. Doubt no longer, but believe. And you know, it worked. The truths that we see are truths that we have to experience. And that's why the incarnation of Jesus in the flesh makes so much sense. It's also why we have church art. Because you can be inspired by a statue of the Blessed Virgin in a way that you're not going to be inspired by an argument about her. There's something that strikes something in our heart. And finally, not only do we know things as a body-soul composite, we also desire them in this way. And this is one of my favorite topics. When I want something, how is it that I want it? Where does that wanting come from? Well, the people who believe that we're only souls, that sort of Plato group, would argue that we simply will things. We just think it and decide it. Emotions have no role to play. In fact, emotions only get in the way. And so we'd be all better off if we just got rid of our emotions entirely. That's the argument of people like Descartes. It's also the argument of a group of early Christians called the Stoics, who argue that basically emotions had to be killed. You had to be cool, calm, and collected in order to think straight. And every emotion would cloud your thinking. And so, for them, the ultimate human nature would have been the nature of Mr. Spock, a Vulcan who had no connection with emotions. Of course, he was half human and he had to fight it all the time. But the underlying assumption was he'd be better off without those emotions. And you know, that's a very tempting thing to think. And I think especially when we're young, when our emotions seem to be so powerful and so painful, we'd really like for them just to go away. When I was moving my office recently, because we're having a construction project too, I was packing up books for my bookshelf, and I came across the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, from the 2nd century. This is one of the foundational works of Stoics. And there in my 18-year-old handwriting, the margins were filled with comments. Because to tell you the truth, almost every 18-year-old guy would love to be free of his emotions. And it's probably true of most girls too. It feels overwhelming at times. It feels like you're riding a roller coaster and you can't get off. Very tempting. But it isn't what human perfection is really about. Think about it. Was Jesus without emotions? What happened when he went to the tomb of Lazarus? He wept. He was moved with compassion over and over again. What happened when he went into the temple and saw the money changers? He was filled with righteous indignation and knotted a cord with knots and turned it into a whip and drove them out. That's not somebody without passions. That's a passionate soul. Did Our Lady feel nothing? No, she had joyful mysteries and she had sorrowful mysteries. Human perfection is not freedom from emotions. Perfect human beings have emotions. On the other hand, people who think that we're only bodies say that emotions are all that matter. And sometimes in our world, that's what we hear too. Let go of all the rules and regulations. Just do what comes naturally. Do whatever you feel like. Some people will even quote St. Augustine about that. Love and do what you will. The number of times I've heard people say this to me when I find out they're thinking about marriage and they're living together, and I say, well, you know, that's really not good. It's not good for your soul right now, and it's not even good for your marriage. Because most people who do that end up having trouble in their marriage. It's far better for you to try your hardest not to do that. And they say, oh, Father, we love each other, and God is love, so he'll understand. I said, yeah, he'll understand all right. He knows rationalization and excuse-making when he hears it. Emotions are not all that matters. The rules and regulations are not just things to get in your way to make your life challenging or difficult. They're there because our human nature can be hurt, and a God who loves us has given us a set of rules. Don't do these things because they'll damage you. Do these things because if you don't, you'll end up deficient. The commandments of God are in fact the secret of happiness. But we feel like we have our arm twisted behind our back saying, okay, God, I'll do it because I have to. You're bribing me with heaven. You're threatening me with hell. And so I'll go along. If this is the secret of your happiness, we really shouldn't have to twist your arm behind your back. That's what Aristotle thought that virtue was. Virtue, he says, was activity, and happiness was activity in accordance with virtue. It's only when you do what's right that you're doing something that's in keeping with your human nature. It's only then that you can be happy. We've all had moments when we did something we knew was good and right. I remember the first time I went to work in a mission. It was the year 2000, and I was in the ghetto of Kingston, Jamaica. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And in the morning, I'd worked in an orphanage. Being the oldest of 7, an orphanage was heartbreaking for me. And by the afternoon, I was like emotionally exhausted. And with a non-failing sense, the people in charge of this mission decided that evening I was going to go work at the AIDS hospice, which is overwhelming too. And at the end of the day, I thought to myself, God, I can't do this. I tried so hard to be generous to these people today. I can't do this. And on the car ride home, I was really on the verge of tears. I got back to the chapel and knelt down. And this awareness that God had given me the opportunity to take care of the poorest of the poor, and that Christ was there in these people, made me recognize that I'd just done something more important than things I'd done before. I was allowed to take part in something way beyond my pay scale. I was taking God's love and giving it hands, giving it a voice, letting it be present in a hellhole. There was a sort of satisfaction that came with the exhaustion, that came with the sense of nausea from the smells. I'm not good with smells. Which tells me again that I have a body, isn't it? I can't distract myself from smells. But the satisfaction that came from working so hard for these people I didn't even know was so good. And I noticed as I went back to the mission over and over, I've been down there about a dozen times, and Dominican Republic a few times, and with Mother Teresa's sisters in Calcutta too. And every time I'd go back to one of these places, I'd see the same people there again. Not because they were bitten by the sense of duty, but because they felt that spark. They felt this being involved in something better. They were doing something difficult, something virtuous, and it felt good. You see, following the rules is not a sacrifice that you make. It's an investment in your own happiness. The saints are called beati, which means blessed, but it also very simply means happy. One of the things that Mother Teresa always impressed people with was, although she had nothing and lived in horrible conditions, I saw her room, she was cheerful. When I was in Calcutta, there's a sign coming down the main staircase there that says, if you can't serve God cheerfully, go back to your room. God doesn't need you. Because you're missing the point if you're not doing it cheerfully. We believe that following the rules and doing it with my passion together produces this fulfillment and happiness. I'm always a little embarrassed when people say, thank you for your sacrifice in becoming a priest. I go, well, you're welcome, I suppose. Except I have a wonderful life. There are some things I can't do, and some things I'm asked to do that I sometimes would rather not do. But on the whole, my life is filled with blessings, filled with joy. You see, we need both this will that looks at the rules, but we also need passions. Because the passions, the emotions, the feelings are an important part of us. Your emotions tell you how things have gone for you in the past. You've stored away all these experiences, and that's what becomes your emotions. They're like a shorthand version of saying, yeah, you don't do so well in these circumstances, and you get a bad reaction to it. I've developed a problem with digesting certain foods. And although I used to love these foods, now when I look at them, I feel a little sick inside. They're the same foods, but I've had bad reactions enough that now my gut reaction is negative. So my emotions tell me an important thing about myself. The church takes advantage of that emotional reaction that you have when it teaches you how to meditate. So often when people pray and they meditate and they think, okay, Jesus is in the garden, you're trying to picture it, and you just think about it as though you were being the director of a movie or something, or preparing for a Bible study class. But you know, that's not really meditating yet. That's just the beginning. Then you have to allow yourself to react to it. If you've turned off your emotions, nothing happens. You need to be able to say, for example, one of my favorites, when St. Peter gets corrected by our Lord and says, Peter, do you love me? And all the other apostles are there with him, and they know that he promised Jesus that he'd defend him even to death, and then betrayed him because that vicious milkmaid asked him a question, and he couldn't stand up to her, so he denied that he had known him. Now 3 times our Lord asks him, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And you can just feel the embarrassment in Peter's mind. You know that the other apostles are looking at him thinking, so, you promised last time, what are you going to say now? And that makes me squirm. Well, the fact that it makes me squirm tells me something about me, doesn't it? Tells me how much I depend upon the opinion of others. At other times I might read that text and think, yeah, you get him, Jesus. I might be on the side of the apostles thinking, jump on, this guy is a betrayer. You get him. And at those times I think, why are you reacting like that? The answer is because I'm being judgmental too, and I need to let go of that. You see, my emotional reaction tells me something valuable about myself. And if I never listen to my reactions, I'm missing out on what that passage from the gospel is actually asking of me in this moment. Meditation requires you to respond emotionally. But I think perhaps even most importantly, having our will and our emotions work together is important because without my emotions, I'm sort of numb. Have you ever seen somebody who was having emotional difficulties and was on a lot of medication? And they just didn't feel much of anything. And I said, what do you feel like now? And they said, sort of numb. Like you turned on the radio and no channels are broadcasting. Nothing really excites me. Nothing really repels me. I just feel dead. Why is that? Because those medications actually turn off our emotional reactions. That ventromedial sector of our prefrontal lobe gets chemically turned off. And you feel numb. Our emotions actually give us the horsepower for our actions. This idea that the emotions are an important part of your decision-making, an important part of your carrying out of your actions, get put forth beautifully in 2 books that I want to end with today. These books are books that I might recommend to different sorts of people, but they're basically giving the same lesson. For those who are more scientifically minded, I tend to be a science geek myself, I would recommend the neurophysiologist Antonio Damasio. His first book is, I think, his best, although they're all worth a read, but the first one is particularly good, and it's called Descartes' Error. Descartes' Error. It starts off with the story of a man named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was working on the railroad in Vermont. He was the head of this team of people who were blasting their way through the White Mountains there, and they would bore a hole by hand into the rock and then place explosives in it with a fuse that came out. But if you just lit that fuse, the explosives would just shoot up like a firecracker coming out of a tube. So what you do is you'd pack sand into the hole. And then you take this long rod, it was about 3.5 feet long, and you tamp that sand in place. So when the explosion happens, instead of the explosion going this way, the explosion would go this way and break up the rock. And then you remove the rock and you do it all over again. Phineas got interrupted partway through the process. He'd put in the explosive and he'd put in the fuse, but he forgot to put in the sand. And as he came back from taking care of whatever he had to take care of, because he was the manager, he picked up his rod and started tamping it down. But when he started tamping it down, with no sand there, as the steel rod hit the rock, it caused sparks. And those sparks detonated the explosives. And that rod, because he was standing like this, went through his cheek and out the top of his head and landed 100 yards away, taking a piece of his skull about this big and a funnel-shaped part of his brain. The man didn't even lose consciousness. It was like a miracle. But something happened to him. The section right behind the bridge of his nose, the ventral medial sector of the prefrontal lobe, which is an emotional center, was destroyed. And this man, who was a manager, now couldn't make decisions. His intelligence was unimpaired. His coordination was all fine. All that was left, all that was gone, was his emotional center. But instead of being the pride and joy of Descartes, cool, calm, and collected like a Stoic or Mr. Spock, he was somebody who couldn't decide which pair of socks to put on. He was handicapped. He ended up going off into a freak show and died a drunk in San Francisco. He'd show the bit of his skull and the rod that went through his head for 3 cents or something. Very sad. But what this proved to Damasio was that the emotions provide an essential function in our decision-making. You don't make your decisions entirely on emotions, but you can't make your decisions entirely using your mind. You need both. The other book, for those who are more literary-minded, is C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. It's one of my favorite books, and I force every group of seminarians to read it and write papers about it. My favorite episode is the story of, this is a story of a man who takes a bus trip to heaven, at least the outskirts of heaven. And he catches the bus basically in hell. Anybody who wants to can get on the bus. But when he gets up there, almost none of the ghosts want to stay. It's not very easy for them up there. He finds a man with a little lizard on his shoulder. The little lizard stands for the man's lust. The man can't go on with the lizard there. And an angel finally talks him into killing it. And when he breaks the back of that lizard and throws it on the ground, the lizard turns into a stallion that he rides into heaven. You see, the passions, once they're properly ordered, once they're mortified, that's the Christian term, once they're mortified, become something powerful. As C.S. Lewis says, backs for us to ride. They give us the horsepower of our actions. Powerful Christians, powerful saints aren't passionless people. They're passionate people, but their passions are governed by their reason. It's this balance between body and soul, emotions and will, sensation and intellect, which makes human beings what we are. And I think so much of understanding the human nature properly begins with understanding that the human being is a composite of body and soul. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to start with questions from wherever.
Thank you very much, Father. It was wonderful. So we have time for some questions for Father. I'll briefly explain our process for this, and then we'll get to it. If you have a question for Father Paul and you're here with us, please queue up on the podium on the right side of the church, my left, your right. And after Father Paul answers your question, please return to your seat by the center aisle. I and a couple of volunteers are going to be asking questions from the live stream using the microphone on the other side of the church, my right, your left. And we'll alternate between in-person questions and questions from online. And because I'm here and we'll give some people some time to queue up if they do indeed have questions, I'll start with an online question for you, Father. So someone asked, Father, how to know when your emotions and reason are well integrated enough that you can trust them? I like this idea, but it seems to contradict, for example, the Jesuit dictum of agere contra, do the opposite of your natural inclination. Likewise, a lot of people remain in a bad situation because they worry they're just not trying or persevering hard enough in one of the virtues if they give way to what their emotions are telling them, or manifestations of scrupulosity. He thanks you for your answer.
Well, discerning when our emotions are proper and when they're not can be a difficult task. First thing, we all have a disposition. I am disposed, for example, to be impatient. I was impatient as a baby. My sisters have baby spoons that are tiny little things, and my baby spoon is like a tablespoon because I couldn't get the food fast enough. So that's been my problem, it seems, since birth. So when I say to act against your disposition, against your regular disposition, what they're saying is, if you tilt in this way, towards impatience, for example, then I need to aim in that direction in order to be upright now. If I have a tree that's bent this way, I pull it and stake it, but I don't stake it straight. Because if I stake it straight, when I unstake it, it's going to go back a little bit, right? So you got to pull it past perpendicular and stake it there and leave it. And then when you let it go, it's going to go to vertical. So that's what they mean about acting against your dispositions. It doesn't mean your dispositions are always wrong, but that your predominant disposition is one that you have to be constantly suspicious of. If you're a fearful person and you don't want to do something because you think it's too hard, then you probably need to say, you're probably wimping out. If you're somebody who's rash and does things without thinking, and you want to do something, you should ask yourself, are you being rash? You probably are. So that's the first part of it. So I think, how do I know when it's working well? Well, one of the Ignatian answers to that is that you make a decision about something interiorly, and then you let it sit with yourself. I remember when I was deciding about the priesthood and marriage and things, and it's a little complicated. No questions about that, please. When I was making those decisions, you'd decide something internally, and then you'd let it sit, and a week later, you'd be driven crazy by it. Or it would settle into place. And if you find peace, then you could know that what you are feeling is in fact something appropriate. So I think there is a lot of discernment, and I think one thing we always need when we're dealing with balancing our emotions is some sort of perspective from somebody else. And that's why talking to our friends, coming to confession or spiritual direction can be so very helpful. Because we all get a little narrow in our vision and don't see ourselves very accurately. The one person whose spiritual direction I cannot do is my own. So that would be what I would suggest.
Hi, Father. Thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So my question has to do with consciousness and trying to understand a little bit more about whether, like, where consciousness and unconsciousness within the brain fit.
Sure.
Between soul and body and that
Yeah.
sort of integration.
Consciousness is an extraordinarily interesting topic. And in fact, the second book by Antonio Damasio, called The Feeling of What Happens, takes up this issue of how do we begin to think about consciousness? St. Thomas talks about consciousness as happening in the brain, in the place called, a function of the brain we call the interior senses, the common sense. But I think the best way to describe his position, which I think is really the same as Damasio's, is that we have consciousness when we take in information. So for example, I look at the striped sweater here in the front row. And when I see that sweater, not only do I have the image of it in my head, but I can also feel my eyes moving and focusing. I'm aware of the fact that my visual cortex has neurons that are firing. And so not only do I know that there is a sweater out there, I also know that I am receiving that information. I can feel myself receiving it. And in feeling myself receiving that information, there must be an I who's here, who's doing that. So we actually learn about ourselves in the act of sensing exterior realities, which is why sense deprivation can become something which is such a torture. So it's in this process of feeling myself experiencing the outside world that consciousness happens. And that's why his book is called The Feeling of What Happens When We Sense. So I think that would be the best way of describing it. And I think it's a brilliant argument, in fact. And it's interesting how somebody like a philosopher like St. Thomas and a neurophysiologist who really doesn't have any philosophical background much at all beyond Descartes, and is coming at it from a purely materialistic way, would come at answers that were so extremely similar. Yeah. Thank you.
Our next online question asks, why does reason need to be connected with the soul? Couldn't you say that reason is an output of the brain or the body?
Yeah. When we say that reason must be beyond the body, something which is in the soul, what we're really saying is that reason is something which is about universal knowledge. Now, this goes back to a deeper question that I said might be too big for now, but we'll come to it now in the questions. If I have a form, let's say I have a form of truck. Well, that form is just an idea in my head. It's not until I put that form into matter that I end up with a truck. I need to have matter to make an individual. When I take that form, that's the sound of abstraction, by the way, I take the form out of matter, I end up with the form by itself, and now I merely have truck again. And that's what my intellect does. It takes that information that came to me through my sensation and abstracts it, and now I have a universal. So it's that idea of universal knowledge. And I think where we get off track about talking about reason is we begin to think about reason as merely the processing of information. And you know the brain does a lot of processing. St. Thomas would talk about those as the interior senses. Think about them as brain functions. There's a lot of that goes on, and the higher animals share in those in an impressive way. But that's not universal knowledge, that's still particularized. What makes the reason different is this ability to move from that particular level to the universal level. So I think often we mistake the processing of our brain, and because it's complicated and impressive, we think it's reason, but it's not. In fact, there might be whole stretches of your day when you don't really use your reason very much. Even when you're doing schoolwork, you might be just memorizing. And that's just using your brain, not your intellect. So part of the reason we're not so comfortable with defining how reason works is that we don't use it nearly as often as we think we do.
Hi, Father. Thank you for your talk. One of the things that got me thinking from your talk was on the distinction between idealism and materialism, and new insights into neuroscience and how the brain works leads to a lot of theories about mental illness and personality disorders and stuff like that.
Oh, yes.
And naturally, that's going to have big implications in areas of law and ethics. But my question is there any way to have a proper distinction between, some personality disorder, to have some of those symptoms be proper to an aberration in the brain, and, in contrast with it being proper to the soul? Is there any way to have like a clean-cut distinction between them?
I think theoretically there can be, but I think in practice it's very difficult. When I have somebody who comes to me, and sometimes I get people sent to me who are very disturbed and who think they're possessed. We have the CAMH in downtown Toronto is on the edge of my parish, and I go into it a fair bit. And when I was walking into it, this one man came up to me and says, "I'm possessed." And I said, "No, you're not." I said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Well, because you ran across the room to talk to the priest," which I don't think anybody who's possessed would want to do. He says, "Oh, will you come visit me too?" And I said, "Yes, I'll come visit you too." Turns out his name was Muhammad, but I still visited him. He was a lovely man and suffering greatly. Imagine what it's like to have this turmoil inside of your head, and not only to think that you're suffering mentally, but to think that you're morally evil because of it. That is horrible to think about. And I think as we understand more and more about mental illness, we recognize that there are real problems in the brain, where the brain gets out of balance and can't get itself back into balance again. Whether that's a matter of neurotransmitters or physiological structures. I certainly think that, for example, schizophrenia would be something that I would want to chase to that thing that we were talking about, consciousness, earlier. Remember, I'm aware of myself because I could feel myself sensing. If I say, "Look at these glasses right now," and I say, "Now picture them to yourself," even though you can't see them. You could do that, can't you? But it feels different when you're seeing them, because you can feel your eyes focusing, your visual cortex going, and when you're recalling it, because a different part of your brain is working. You know the difference between remembering or imagining. Imagine a yellow ball in front of your face. Can you do that? Sure. But you know you're imagining it. It's at that level of consciousness, I think, that schizophrenia happens, because there the ability to distinguish an image which is recalled or imagined but seems real, that's broken down. So I think there are some philosophical ways to try to pinpoint where the function goes wrong, and then neurophysiologists can try to figure out the mechanisms that produce those functions. Okay?
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Sorry, I'm sort of wearing two hats here, but I have a question. It's a question that goes back early on in the talk. You were talking about how our bodies individuate us, and that in the new creation, of course, we're going to be getting not just any body back, but our body back. And I wonder what the Catholic worldview, or the teaching is on that space or time or duration that we're in heaven after death, but the new creation has not occurred yet, because it seems from the account that there would be nothing to individuate us. There would be nothing about me left after death.
That's a very interesting question. And I think it is sort of mysterious, but I think we can approach it. For this, I use the example of green Jell-O. I think lime-flavored Jell-O is only good for examples because I don't really like to eat it. But imagine making a batch of green Jell-O and putting it into a Mickey the Mouse mold. When it's done, you turn it out, and you lift it up, and the Jell-O comes out, and it's in the shape of Mickey Mouse. And even though you've taken the mold away, so long as you keep the Jell-O refrigerated, it keeps its shape. Your body, this is St. Thomas's speculation, your body individualizes your soul upon contact. And then your soul retains what's called an orientation to that body permanently. And that's why, if I want to take that, let's say nobody eats the Jell-O at the party because it's green Jell-O, and so you want to take it home with you, you put it back into the mold and it fits exactly, doesn't it? Because it's kept the shape. So there's something about our soul that keeps its relationship to that body and keeps it forever. Now, how do I know things? That's a slightly different issue, because and the answer to that is that God has to provide me with direct knowledge of things through the beatific vision. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any way of knowing, because my knowledge comes from my senses. So God has to sort of bypass my normal way of knowing and give me a glorious way of knowing. But my individuation remains because my soul has the imprint of my body. But imagine the rejoicing of this glorious soul that's been in God's presence when it gets its body back. That moment of rejoicing is outrageous. In Dante's Paradiso, which I've just been finishing, when Dante's talking to the souls, he says, "You have everything. Is there anything you look forward to?" And they say, "Getting our bodies back." Both because it will increase our joy, but also because we'll be able to hold the ones we love. I thought, really? That's good. Imagine that, after being a soul, getting your body back, and feeling those emotions charge with all the joy of heaven. You were as joyful as you could possibly imagine, and all of a sudden joy became bigger than you thought was possible. So, something will happen, and you'll be even more glorious.
Shall I ask a question?
Sure. You've asked a few in your years.
I do have one question. This will be the last question before we say thank you. You were just speaking about the resurrection of the body and this life of heaven. It's always confounded me, and I prayed and thought about it, and I still don't have an answer. What does that look like, to live eternity in the body? Can you shed any light on that mystery? Because
I
we're
think
so limited, right?
this idea of entering into eternity is a bit of a misnomer, because in fact eternity is something that only God possesses. God has everything all at once. That's what eternity is. It's not forever and ever, world without end, amen. That's not eternity. Eternity is like all together, all at once. Imagine every thought and action you had concentrated into one action. That's God. Pure act. Eternity for us, entering into eternity, means seeing God face to face. But for me, because I'm a being who thinks and experiences, for me, there'll still be time. I'll still understand things step by step. There'll still be before and after for me. So before or after my body, I'm living in time. I'll have time for forever. And one hopes that God will provide things for me to do in heaven. That's why he talks about a new heavens and a new earth. Because you're not just going to be a body like floating in space. To be happy, you're going to have things to do. And in the same way that God gave Adam and Eve the Garden of Eden to till and take care of, so that they can fulfill themselves, God will give us a new heavens and a new earth so that we can do things forever, but without the penalties and the pains and the limitations of sin.
I've wanted to ask that question for years, so thank you. Thank you, Father Paul, and just this opportunity to be able to gather together, though limited in person, but I know many who are joining us online, has truly been great, and especially for me as a student of yours from so many years ago. I entered seminary in 2004. Father Paul knew the young 19-year-old Father Marcus. We had dinner just before, Father Paul, and was really struck, with how all of these years have gone by and the many graces and blessings that God has given to me in my life. But I remember that the first course I took when I was in seminary was this anthropology, and then epistemology, and then natural theology. And I have to say for myself, so much of what I've discovered in the spiritual life and the great gift of the priesthood has built upon those foundations. You know that personally, but thank you for what you've been able to share with us tonight, that these are the foundations of our faith, knowing who we are as human beings, knowing, as we so beautifully turn towards there at the end, what we are called to share in eternity, for all eternity, forever. Make the right distinction, as Father used to always say. So thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for coming to visit Canadian Martyrs, McMaster, and we hope you'll join us again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you again, Father Paul. That's all we have for the evening. This concludes our time. The next lecture in our series will be taking place in July on the 29th. That's also a Thursday at 7 p.m. and it'll be delivered by Father Jason Kuntz, who is a instructor of moral theology at St. Peter's Seminary, and he'll be delivering a lecture on theology. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on the live stream. Thank you for attending in person. Thank you to all the volunteers who helped us out, and thank you most especially, and again, to Father Paul for joining us.